Assalamu alaikum. Thanks for joining us on Your Muslim Neighbor. Today we're talking about a couple of narratives that are found in the collection of Bukhari that seem to indicate that Aisha, when she got married to the Prophet, was 6 years old and consummated the marriage at 9. And what I'm hoping to do today is to share with you some information from previous muhaddithin and scholars of Islam and famous historians that believe this narration to be very, very flawed. Not just this narration, but other related narrations. So we'll start. One of the things about the narrations found in Bukhari is that they all have something common. Every single narration in the collection of Bukhari that mentions these specific ages are narrated through Hisham ibn Urwa. Hisham ibn Urwa was a native to the city of Medina, where he spent all of his life, about 70 years or so. He later relocated to Kufa, which in today's Iraq. So in his 70s, he was in Iraq and thereafter. The reason I'm mentioning this is because this provides a break from when the traditionists or the people that recorded hadith stopped narrating from him. Many scholars of Islam stopped narrating from him through the people of Iraq. And one of the most notable people that I could think of is Imam Malik, one of the great, four imams, so to speak, of the Muslim community. He was part of the Salaf. He had the first, or one of the first, compilations of hadith and a great jurist. He outright rejected all the traditions coming from Hisham ibn Urwa through the Kufans. And this was for a few reasons. In Tahdhib al-Tahdhib, which is a very reputable book talking about the narrators themselves, Yaqub ibn Shayba was reported to have said that basically all of the narrations from Hisham are good except those narrated from the people of Iraq. And many other scholars go on to mention this same point. It's just highlighted over and over again. In Mizan al-I'tidal, which is another book of narrators, it just talks about the Asma' Rijal, the name of the narrators and what their position is. It talks about Hisham, as he got older, he suffered from bad memory loss. So there's different statements that indicate that just people altogether started to not narrate from him, whereas previously they didn't find any flaw. It might have been an innocent mistake. I mean, when someone gets to a certain age, sometimes they have suffered bad memory loss. But whether it was intentional or unintentional, it's irrelevant because it's not intent that is discussed in Asma' Rijal. It's always what people have said about that person. So if the people have said that this person is an unreliable narrator, beyond that it really doesn't bear any credibility to the statement at hand. So the next thing is, outside of Hisham ibn Urwa's narratives, are there any other chains of narration that would indicate that she was either 6 or 9? And there's a few others outside of it, very few. One of them could be thrown out right away, because the fifth person in the chain is listed as a man from Quraysh, which in terms of any kind of isnad is a joke. You never have Muhammad ibn Shayba reported from Anas ibn Malik, and then the person at the top of the chain or at the bottom of the chain is a person from Quraysh or a person from Iraq. It's absurd and just is thrown out right away. There's actually another one which talks about an individual known by the name of Muhammad ibn Amr. And again, a lot of books highlight his weakness as well. I won't get into all of them, but in al-Dhahabi, there's so many different books that talk about the weakness. So these other chains are also weak and usually are not used, even by people that promote this idea and accept the narration in Bukhari dealing with this age. They don't accept these other narrations. They use it as corroborating evidence just because it confirms what they want to believe, but in and of themselves, they don't use them to promote the idea itself because it's weak and it doesn't have basis. There's another thing that should be added. In Bukhari itself, before we get into any other collections, there is a narrative where Aisha is reported to have said that basically the 54th surah, Surah Al-Qamar, in the Quran, she quotes the 46th ayah specifically, but this specific surah she describes as being revealed when she was a little girl. And according to most historians, this surah was a Meccan surah, an early Meccan surah. And in one of Suyuti's books, Ibn Kathir, there's a lot of Asbab al-Nuzul, reports that indicate that this was an early Meccan surah. So the thing is if she was a jariyah, which this is what the narrative describes her as, she describes herself as being a jariyah at the time that this was being revealed. And all of the reports indicate that her marriage was around the time of Hijrah. So if this surah was being revealed years before Hijrah, and she was a young girl then, but the other report is saying that she was a jariyah and a young girl at the time of Hijrah, they obviously can't, they can't be reconciled. One of them has to be weak or both, which, we'll get into that later. In addition to that, we could look at other reports and other historical facts and use those to make some kind of timetable. One of the things that's mentioned is her older sister, Asma. There's a report that says that Abu Bakr, all of his children that when they were born during the time of pre-Islam, during the time of Jahiliyyah. So a lot of people mark Aisha's birth at around the time of the beginning of the call, when the Prophet first got revelation and started preaching, at around that time. The other thing was that Aisha's older sister, Asma, is reported to have been about 10 years older than her, and she died in 73 Hijrah at the age of 100. Now, obviously, if you do the math, this completely contradicts Hisham ibn Urwa's narratives regarding the age of Aisha. But what's even more interesting in that is who said that she was 100 years old anyway when she died, Asma? And it was actually Hisham ibn Urwa. He was the one narrating. He said something along the lines of, she died at 100 years old and she didn't even have a tooth missing. That was his narrative. And that narrative conflicts with his other narrative. And of course, he's guilty of tadlis, and this is what the scholars have ascribed to him. But if you do the math, 73 years after Hijrah, if she was 100 years old, and you subtract the 73 from 100, she died at 100 in the 73rd year of Hijrah, that would make her about 27 or 28 years old at the time of Hijrah, at the time where it's reported Aisha got married. And if Aisha got married at the time of Hijrah, and she was 10 years younger than Asma, then that would make her around 17 or 18, which means that her nikah and the consummation were a few years apart. So she could have been older. Estimates from 18 all the way to 21 have been sourced. And that's a huge point to take heed of, because one of the same narrators in both of these is reporting conflicting things. So I'm not asserting she was 18, 19, 20, or 21, nor am I asserting any other specific age. What I'm trying to show are the weaknesses in all of the narrations regarding this, and trying to purport that there is no conclusive evidence either way. But really the one that I'm trying to talk about is the 6 and 9 one, and the weaknesses in that, because that's the one that we're talking about. And the other thing is that Fatima was reported to be 5 years or so older than Aisha. And it's narrated that Fatima was born at the time when the Prophet was about 35. So if the Prophet was born 570 approximately, and 35, that would be 605 AD, which would put Aisha at around 609, 610. If Hijrah was about 622, 623, again, you're getting into mid to late teens, not 6, not 9. Really, the only reason people say that she was this young, she was 6 or 9, falls on one sole narration, and that is the one that is reported through Hisham primarily. Those other narrations we did mention, not the ones that are used to defend it, more so to corroborate it, but the ones coming from Hisham ibn Urwa. Hisham ibn Urwa, like I stated before, a lot of scholars did not accept any of his traditions through the Kufan people. And the fact that he did live in Medina for 70 years and any of the Medinans reported this story means that he never narrated it in Medina, which means that it was either due to memory loss, as one of the other scholars have attributed to him, or it could have been from someone else in the chain through Kufa, which was why Imam Malik never accepted any of those reports. Whatever the case is, that was one of the issues that was raised. In addition to that, it really becomes, the question is, does it become a problem? Does it pose a problem? And in reality, it doesn't. It's, there are a lot of different historical narratives. Some are authentic, some are unauthentic. We have to look at each one and judge them individually. The real big issue that comes out of this is the idea of canonization. A lot of people have began to look at these books as being canonized, namely Bukhari's. And what's interesting about that is basically both the word and the procedure, canonization, comes from our Christian predecessors in an attempt by the clergy to control what the masses believe. And that will be done dismissing major flaws and holes in the sources, in the primary sources that are used to come up with those ideas to begin with. You'll hear things like, hey brother, it's Bukhari. You can't argue with that. Once it's in Bukhari, it's canonized. You can't go into it individually. And that's what's sad, is because any other hadith book, whatever it be called, whatever author put it together, people can go in and judge each individual narrative based on its merit. But people do not do that with Bukhari. They think it's beyond and above recalculation or reanalysis. So when, for example, the famous contemporary muhaddith Nasruddin al-Albani quoted some hadith in Bukhari and Muslim and showed flaws in them, people started making accusations and got really, really emotional about it. It became less and less about critically analyzing something and more about dogma. And this is definitely a problem for the science of hadith. So the word sahih itself means completely authentic. Who is it that said that it was completely authentic? Was it the Prophet? No. Bukhari never met the Prophet. He was born in around 194 after Hijrah, and he never met the Prophet. He never met the companions. So he came around much later on, and people, his contemporaries did not accept everything that he said the way people do today. So Daraqutni is narrated to have criticized over 100 different narrators in the collection of Bukhari. Imam Abu Hanifa had certain issues with him. There were other scholars as well that even his student Muslim, you hear about Bukhari and Muslim had such issues that it's reported they didn't even talk toward the ends of their lives, and he went on to make his own collection, and that's the collection of Muslim, where some of the narrations are mutual, but some of them they don't report from each other. Bukhari, it was known that he narrated from the Khawarij, and when asked about it, his response was basically, well, they're not known to lie, So these are the kind of things that you have to think about. They say, it's the most authentic book after the Book of Allah, the most authentic book after the Book of God. This is what's been claimed about Bukhari. But who? Who is the one that actually said that? Well, Imam Shafi'i said that same phrase about the collection of Imam Malik, the Muwatta. So this was kind of just copied and compounded and attributed to Bukhari's book later on. But really, you have to study each individual narration according to its own merit. And at the end of the day, Islam does teach us to become diligent believers and to use our brains, as the Quran often begins. And it begs the question, أَفَلَا يَعْقِلُونَ, which means, do they not use their brains? I'd like to share the following statement by one of the most celebrated Islamic historians, and his name was Imam al-Tabari. Tabari said in the introduction of his treatise on Islamic history, "I hereby testify that news and stories that readers may find strange or false, unbelievable or awkward, or inaccurate were in fact what I heard from others, which upon I stated in my book as they were without direct or indirect interference." Basically, as he heard it, he reported it. He didn't add anything, he didn't take anything out, he didn't put anything in. And then he ends by saying, "Thus I declare no responsibility upon them." So he's washing his hands clean of the narratives in his book. I conclude with an ayah of the Quran regarding this issue, and that's to be found in the 4th surah of the Quran, ayah 82, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God is talking about the Quran itself. And he says, وَلَوْ كَانَ مِنْ عِنْدِ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ لَوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا. And if it had been from other than God, certainly they would have found in it many discrepancies and contradictions. And as we've seen from these narratives, that's all we've seen actually, is discrepancies and contradictions. So the question arises, then what was the age of Aisha? There are no reliable enough traditions to point to a specific age. However, the age of 6 and 9, the only narratives that have ever suggested those two ages are extremely inauthentic and have been rejected since the time of the Salaf. And that's something that should be drilled in everybody's head after watching this. It's not some guy sitting and making a YouTube video that's coming up with this. very prominent scholars of Islamic history, specialists of the ahadith and the riwayat and ilm al-rijal themselves, have rejected these narratives. Assalamu alaikum.